Today I'm here to give an informative speech about saxophone, specifically the alto saxophone. I will be discussing the history of the saxophone, how and when it is used, and a little about how it works. So, how did the saxophone become such a popular instrument? Compared to other woodwind instruments, it's actually fairly new. The saxophone was created in the 1840s by a man named Adolphe Sax. For comparison, clarinets were developed around 100 years later. That's according to Gregory Barrett in a 1999 article. And according to Yamaha, which is a very popular instrument brand, this is actually a Yamaha. Oboes were created around the 17th century, with bassoons in the 16th century. And around the time of the saxophone, the modern flute that we use today was also created, but the flute itself in various other versions has been around for thousands and thousands of years. So why was it made? From Yamaha's website, the saxophone was created to bridge the gap between brass and woodwind instruments. In traditional orchestras, there's the violins and stuff, and that's the strings, the percussion, the brass, and woodwinds. So this was created to be between those two. And it's still not really considered an orchestra instrument, and there's a lot of classical pieces that were obviously created before it that don't have saxophone parts. And while that's getting better, it's still not considered an orchestral instrument. According to Kat Eschner from Smithsonian Magazine on March 22nd, 2017, saxophones were seen as like a comedy instrument used in vaudeville shows, and that kind of continued until the early 20th century in the 1920s. So since it is fairly new and not used in a lot of classical pieces, where is it used? So, despite what I just said, a lot of classical pieces, or classical style pieces that have been composed after, have started to use the saxophone as a piece, and older pieces will have different parts arranged for the saxophone. So sometimes it's a clarinet part, or a French horn, or the trumpet, and sometimes it's some sort of mix of all of those, and it'll play with all of them because it's a very middle range instrument in the band. But probably the most well-known genre for the saxophone is jazz. So with the early 20th century and the jazz movement in the United States especially, the saxophone sort of helped that, and jazz also helped the saxophone gain more recognition and more respect, with such artists as Charlie Parker and John Coltrane really helping it gain popularity and respect as an actual instrument. So it's mainly used in jazz, but it is still used in classical music and symphonic band styles. So how does it work? So this is an alto saxophone, and there's a few different types of saxophones, with the main four being the alto, the tenor, the baritone, and the soprano, with the soprano being a higher range instrument and the tenor and bari being lower. There's actually a lot of different types of saxophones, and there's a video from the United States Army Field Band called Unheard of Instruments in the Saxophone Family that goes over a lot of the really interesting obscure ones, and that was published to YouTube on April 21st of 2015. So they all play very similar, but it's just their size and shape that give them different sounds. So while the saxophone is made out of brass, it is actually considered a woodwind because it is played with a reed, which vibrates and produces sound. It's just a small piece of cane wood, and it goes on the mouthpiece, and it is used to make sound. And then a lot of people would think that it's a difficult instrument to play because it has a lot of buttons, and it does, but it's actually not as hard as many people would think, with these 3 buttons up here being used primarily, one on the back to switch the octaves up and down, and then these 3 buttons down here. And then all of the other buttons are used by the palm or the pinky finger, and they create sharps or flats. So there's a lot more that goes into playing the instrument, obviously, but I've just given some brief overviews of the basics. So I've just discussed some of the history behind the saxophone, what types of music it is primarily used in, and how it works. The saxophone is a relatively new instrument, but it has very interesting history behind it. Thank you for listening today.